Okay. Okay, perfect. Do you have a notification now?
Oh yeah, here it is. It says you're recording the call, so we're good.
All right, perfect. All right, well, everybody, welcome to the second episode of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I am very delighted that our second guest is Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is a lawyer, political activist, a correspondent for the Real News Network on all things Canada and the environment. And he is now running for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. So we're hopefully going to try to get through as many questions as possible. Dimitri, welcome to One Plus One.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be your second guest.
It's a pleasure. It's especially as a follow-up to Eve Angler, who I've had on twice to talk about all things Canada.
Yeah, no, even and I are good friends and work very closely in the activist community. So I think you definitely did the right thing by having him on. He's an incredible guy.
And both based in Montreal as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we've done a lot of disruptive activity here in Montreal together, you and I.
which we are definitely going to get into, but. All right, let's get to it before time runs out, because I know you're very busy with this leadership bid. So, all right, here it goes. So, let's talk about your bid for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. And so the first question is why run as a Green? Because I'm pretty sure many people in the left-leaning media of Canada will say, why run as a Green as opposed to the new Democratic Party?
So for me, it begins with the core values of the Green Party. There are 6 core values. They're shared globally by various Green parties around the world, and they include values that mean a great deal to me, particularly in the current circumstances in which we find ourselves, including nonviolence, social justice, participatory democracy. I think that's extremely important. Ecological wisdom, sustainability. And so when I think that those 6 values come as close as any core values of any political party in Canada today to defining how I think and feel about the issues. But secondly, we have a problem in this is not a problem that's confined the world, and we see this in Europe, and we've seen it for quite some time, that the leadership of parties that have kind of entered the mainstream have drifted to the right of the base. And the Green Party is no exception to this. This is even more pronounced, this tendency within the traditionally Social Democratic Party in Canada, the New Democratic Party. Yeah. Its leadership has been well to the right of the base for some time. Eve may have talked to you about this. I know that Eve and I are in complete agreement on this.
Yeah,
and so
definitely.
What we have in our country and what we have in many countries in the Western world is a void on the left. There's people pretending to be, defending the values and goals of the left, but they really aren't. And so we need to get people in positions of authority within these parties who actually do represent the base and do champion the causes of the left. And I think it's easiest to do that within the Green Party. The Green Party is a more participatory democracy-oriented party than any other party in Canada's parliament. It's a smaller party. The establishment is more open to these kinds of ideas than you'll find in other more mainstream parties. So that's basically it in a nutshell. I think there's an opportunity here for us to really fill a massive political void on the left in this country. And I'm hoping that I can persuade other members of the Green Party who don't traditionally think in these terms. There are many who do, but some don't traditionally think in these terms. I'm hoping I can persuade them that this is the best path forward for the party.
And do you feel that some of the people who are supporters of the NDP, but maybe they have been, but maybe some of them don't like the leadership of Jagmeet Singh. Do you think Jagmeet Singh has failed to take use of the opportunity that the third dominant party, which is the NDP, has in terms of holding Justin Trudeau's Liberals to account and staving off another right-wing tide of the Conservative Party of Canada?
Sure, I think that the proof is in the pudding. Jagmeet Singh, under Jagmeet Singh in the first election in which he was leader, the NDP had a terrible result. You know, at the end, it was a kind of strange dynamic because people were expecting it to be worse for the NDP than it actually was, and because Jagmeet Singh kind of recovered a little bit of ground towards the end of the campaign, a lot of people have tried to spin that as having been a positive outcome for the NDP. But when you compare what happened to the NDP in the last election to what happened to the NDP in the prior election, which many people thought was a disaster, this election was absolutely atrocious as an outcome for that party. They got eviscerated. And in Quebec, I believe they only retained one seat. They had had this huge wave in Quebec under Jack Layton, who was two leaders removed, or one leader removed from Jagmeet Singh, and they just got wiped out in Quebec. The financial situation of the party is in shambles. Their seat count is in shambles. So Jagmeet Singh, to be fair to him, he kind of tried to move the party a little bit more in a progressive direction after Thomas Mulcair, who was an unmitigated neoliberal disaster, very much in the mode of Tony Blair. Tom Mulcair actually praised Margaret Thatcher before he became the leader of the New Democratic Party. So he's made a little bit of ground back, Jagmeet, to be fair to him. He's tried to be a little bit more progressive, but fundamentally there's been no dramatic change, and that's what we need. We need dramatic change. And I think the Green Party offers the best alternative for that.
So the NDP, last question about the NDP specifically. Do you think that they're too much of a diet liberal party?
I think that they are essentially the Liberal Party with a more worker-oriented spin, shall we say, and a little bit more sympathetic. It's funny to watch these three big parties in Canada pretend that they are all, fighting each other tooth and nail and putting on a big show of partisanship and disagreement. But when you actually cut through all of the rhetoric and look at the substance of their policies, the positions of their leadership, there's remarkably little disagreement between them. And so what they do is they try to adopt nuances and slightly more progressive policies or more right-wing policies if you're a conservative, to carve out pieces of the electorate like they're a pie, just to be eaten. Well, what I think we need is somebody in the political spectrum in this country who's truly devoted to the progressive values of Canadians, and I think the vast majority of Canadians are progressive, and is not going to simply feed the populist rhetoric that really isn't backed up by substance. I think there's really a strong hunger for that in electorates across the Western world. And this crisis that we're currently in, the COVID-19 crisis, I think has only strengthened the desire of people to see true, principled, honest leaders of integrity come forward and confront the forces of the status quo to enact the kinds of dramatic changes that we need in order to have a better world and to save our planet.
Perfect segue into my second question, because you've once said at a Venezuela solidarity meeting that you're not afraid to describe yourself as a leftist, and I saw you in a leadership debate with two other candidates, and you mentioned the term eco-socialism, and that brings thrills up my spine. Somebody who is a member of the Green Party but actually uses the term eco-socialism and is not afraid to even use the S word, because other Green Party members throughout the West sometimes are very afraid of describing their policies as socialistic, or even calling themselves socialist. So for you, what is eco-socialism?
Well, eco-socialism is simply a system in which it's, first of all, a system that is sustainable. And not only sustainable in the sense that we can indefinitely maintain the system, but sustainable in the sense that our economic system prioritizes the health of our planet. Number one. Number two, it's a system which prioritizes the interests of the most vulnerable rather than the most privileged. And we don't have such an economic system anywhere in the West anymore. It's a system which trusts government, which actually asks government to play a very powerful role in ensuring that every single human being has a reasonable opportunity to achieve his or her potential, and every single human being has the essentials of life. And that means housing, that means healthcare, that means education, that means daycare, that means pharmacare. So all of these things in an eco-socialist system are guaranteed to every single member of society. An eco-socialist society is one which truly believes in the universality of human rights, doesn't give lip service to human rights and employ them, for example, when you're criticizing the government of Venezuela, but flushing them down the toilet when you're supporting the murderous autocracy of Saudi Arabia. We actually believe in universality of human rights, and we are committed to that. An eco-socialist system is one that believes that infinite growth, the kind of model that we have now, is not good, that it's actually going to result in a disaster, and that we need to reimagine what wealth and human well-being really mean. And an eco-socialist system is fundamentally egalitarian. So, within those parameters, there are a lot of different types of social and economic organizations that are possible. A friend of mine who's an eco-socialist said to me, no one has a patent on eco-socialism, and it falls across a spectrum. But I don't think you can reasonably describe yourself as an eco-socialist without being committed to those principles that I articulated. And I really don't see why anybody would have a problem with any of those principles, frankly. I don't see why anybody would be scared of them. And so when people ask me, are you an eco-socialist? I'm not only an eco-socialist, but I'm proud to say that I'm eco-socialist. And I don't understand why people are running in fear from that term. We should embrace it.
Exactly. And if you were leader of the Green Party and you had a very good, passionate, base that's ready to fight for these ideas, articulate these ideas, and even debate these ideas if the Canadian corporate media will allow it. So would your party then embrace the Leap Manifesto, which is sort of the Canadian version of what Dr. Jill Stein's Green New Deal, or AOC's Green New Deal, is in the U.S. and the Green Party of the U.K.?
That's a very interesting question. I was actually at COP21 in Paris in my capacity as a reporter for The Real News in December 2015, and I had the opportunity to ask Elizabeth May, who was the leader of the Green Party of Canada. You can see this interview on YouTube about the Leap Manifesto, and she said, quite honestly, we are the only party in the Canadian Parliament that has endorsed the Leap Manifesto. And then I followed that up with a question to her, and I said, well, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially the Leap Manifesto's underlying premise is that the capitalist system is at the core of the climate crisis. And I asked her to comment on that, and she was, I thought, a little bit equivocal in terms of her response. So even though the Green Party has formally endorsed the Leap Manifesto and did that 5 years ago, there are people within our party who I don't think have necessarily understood what the basic critique of the Leap Manifesto is. And the basic critique of the Leap Manifesto is that it is the capitalist system that is the core of the climate crisis. Anybody who reads Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, and reads it carefully and objectively, I don't know what other message you could take away from that book. I think that's the core message. And Naomi Klein and the authors, the founders of the Leap Manifesto, are absolutely right. Does that mean there's no place for free enterprise in our society? There's no place for private property? No, there's a place for them, but within very carefully circumscribed boundaries. And the notions of private property and free enterprise, and I'm talking about real free enterprise, not this fake free enterprise we have today, which is really an almost form of economic enslavement, that these things need to be constrained by the state, supervised rigorously by the state with a view to ensuring the public interest at every step of the way. And if you understand that, then you really are endorsing the Leap Manifesto. And I think people need to understand in Canada what that, a lot of people feel very sympathetic to the Leap Manifesto, but I think we really need to appreciate what the fundamental critique of the Leap movement is. It's all about capitalism.
And if you become party leader and push for a Green New Deal, or very much push for the Leap Manifesto, you're going to be having to confront the ruling Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, which is the rival oligarchic party, as well as the NDP, who as you mentioned previously, the leadership is is not in sync with actually what many of their supporters want, which many of them would like to see Leap Manifesto and Green New Deal. So before I talk specifically about more expanding on eco-socialism and how imperialism is tied to it, can you talk briefly, if it's even possible, can you talk about the environmental record of the ruling Liberal Party and before the progressive conservatives, and just a little bit of how the Trudeau government is actually continuing much of the environmentally destructive policies of Stephen Harper that he was widely I'm talking about, was widely derided about.
Yeah, the liberal record on the environment is an abomination. It's an absolute abomination. Under successive liberal governments, there has been a relentless increase in Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. At every step of the way, liberal governments have been throwing lavish support at the fossil fuels industry. So let's talk about the current liberal government. The current liberal government said they were going to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, amounting in this country to about $3 billion a year. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody who really cares even remotely about the climate crisis, I think, would have to agree that eliminating fossil fuel subsidies is a no-brainer. You're quite literally throwing gas on the climate fire when you invest public money in propping up this planet-wrecking and dying industry. So they reneged on that promise. Justin Trudeau was criticizing Stephen Harper's pathetic emission reduction targets when he was in opposition, and as soon as he became the prime minister, he adopted those very same targets. Studies have shown that right up until the COVID-19 crisis, in which we've undoubtedly seen a plummeting, the one silver lining in global greenhouse gas emissions, up until that moment in time, we weren't even on a pace to meet Stephen Harper's pathetic emission reduction targets. We were going to blow through those. Justin Trudeau has spent billions of dollars to buy a planet-wrecking tar sands pipeline. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is planning to spend additional billions to actually construct the thing. And I think he basically bailed out a very wealthy U.S. oil and gas company when he did that, when he purchased that pipeline. It was a doomed project from the beginning. It has no economic sense about it. So, I could go on and on about the environmental record of the Liberal Party. Are they marginally better than the Conservatives? Perhaps. But have they actually begun to implement the types of measures that the scientific community has been arguing we have to adopt for years? Not at all. Not at all. And if we remain under that kind of a leadership, we're doomed. We are absolutely doomed. We need to, completely abandon the path that the Liberals and Conservatives have taken us on for decades, and accept the fact that the fossil fuels industry in this country must be shut down. We have to say it. Like, we can't even say the words in this country. It's a taboo to talk about leaving it in the ground, to talk about phasing out the fossil fuels industry. You get your head cut off if you say that in the mainstream media. I'm going to say it. Yeah. And we need to have leaders who are at least willing to say it, and then they have to be willing to implement it. We don't even have leaders who are willing to say it. So that's the kind of sorry state that this country is in. We as a country have failed in our duty to humanity to deal with the climate crisis. We have disproportionately emitted greenhouse gases. It's time for us to carry our weight. And I think the majority of Canadians understand that, and they want a leader who's serious about it.
But on Wikipedia, Brian Mulroney, who was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, which was, once upon a time, it was the rival, I would describe it as the rival oligarchic, but a bit socially liberal party to the Liberal Party. And on Wikipedia, Brian Mulroney was depicted as a climate hero.
The bar has got to be pathetically low.
Your response to that.
But to be fair to Brian Mulroney, he probably was more sensitive about environmental needs than Stephen Harper. But that's not saying anything, because Stephen Harper was a lunatic. Stephen Harper could not have cared less about the environment. And if it wasn't for people, on the left of political spectrum imposing some restraint on him, I'm sure he would have even done more harm to the environment. So the bar is very low in this country. Is Brian Mulroney better than Stephen Harper? Sure. He may even be better than Justin Trudeau. But that's not saying anything. We don't need to be, what we need is not leaders who are marginally better than disastrous leaders. We need leaders who are actually serious about addressing this existential crisis that we confront. Canada has not yet had such a leader.
Yeah, because you can't negotiate with science. The planet is dying, and now is not the time for for things like, well, okay, so Jeremy Corbyn lost this time around, but don't worry, as long as we're going to get another left-wing leader this time around in X amount of years, and I keep having to say to people, but guys, these are not normal times. With the climate crisis, we really need radical change now.
Now, that's the operative word. Now, we can't wait any longer. Ultimately, I'm not by nature somebody who likes to. I have reservations about political life. I have reservations about the lack of privacy that politicians seem to have to endure. I have reservations about not being a free agent, as I am now as an activist and independent journalist. I have reservations about the fact that anybody who comes forward with the kind of program that I'm going to be advocating for is going to get attacked very aggressively by some very powerful constituencies. It wasn't an easy decision for me to get involved in this race. I really sort of like the life I had before, but it's the urgency of the moment that persuaded me that I've got to get into this race. And I hope I can win. I think I am the best candidate in the race, but even if all I can accomplish is moving the conversation in the direction in which it needs to go and talking about the things that other candidates are not willing to talk about, that in and of itself will have been worthwhile. But my goal is ultimately power for the public good. And that's what every single politician and activist and progressive in this country needs to understand. Without political power, we are not going to do what's necessary to save our planet. We need somehow to find a way to seize political power.
Now, going back to what is eco socialism and watching your debate with the two other contenders, you've made it clear foreign policy, imperialism, fighting and fighting imperialism / militarism is an inseparable issue in the fight against climate change and the sustainable economy. Talk more about that.
Well, sure. There's so many ways in which these issues are intertwined. One is that the militaries of this world are one of the worst greenhouse gas emitters on the planet, and so if we can't rein them in, how are we going to rein in our greenhouse gas emissions globally? In order for us to solve this problem, which doesn't respect borders, we have to have a very, very high and unprecedented degree of international cooperation and consensus. Military conflict undermines that. We have to have stability. We need economic stability. Military conflict undermines social and economic stability. In every conceivable way, militarism is undermining the fight against climate change. We have to, and furthermore, they're consuming massive public resources, vast amounts of public wealth, which we could divert to, creating renewable energy systems, retrofitting our buildings, enhancing mass transport. So I think
also eliminating third world poverty amongst indigenous people in North America and
totally. What militaries at the end of the day are guardians of a grossly inequitable system in this world. They're the ones who are the enforcers for a global elite that has basically, condemned hundreds of millions, billions of people to poverty. So we can't solve the climate crisis without restraining militarism, without demilitarizing, without reallocating massive resources to socially productive uses, and without eliminating violence. This is what we have to do. These problems are inseparable, and one of the things that I think the Green Party can do a lot better in Canada is explain to Canadians the intimate connection between these two problems. Mm-hmm. And I think that we as a party have been far too weak in critiquing militarism, far too tepid and timid in calling for a demilitarization and a drastic reduction in military spending. And we should be having a serious conversation about getting out of NATO. We should be advocating for withdrawal from NATO. Why are we in that destructive military alliance, which has caused so much suffering in the last 20 years and beyond? So, you can't even say the words withdrawal from NATO in this country without getting your head bit off by the corporate media. Well, someone's got to start the conversation. And I don't invite the enmity of the corporate media, but if that's the price I have to pay to start the conversation, I'm prepared to do that.
And why do you think? Actually, no. Continuing on with foreign policy. Before I actually get to this written question, because you mentioned Venezuela, and there's even an issue amongst socialist movements and even socialist governments like the Bolivarian governments of Venezuela, which I have to add is a democratically elected democratic socialist government, which is under siege by Canada, Britain, France, the U.S. If you could be an advisor to Maduro, or even the previously ousted president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, when it comes to oil extraction, which they still which they do use to fund their healthcare services and trying to uplift people out of poverty. If you could be an advisor to them, would you say to them, hey, if you really want the West to stop using the petrodollar as a way to sanction you and trying to stop your progressive movement, you should adopt a Green New Deal or a Leap manifesto. Do you think they would be susceptible to that?
I don't know, how they would react to that kind of a recommendation, but it's certainly one that I would argue for strenuously. I think this was a major mistake that Chavismo made, is that it didn't act nearly assertively enough to wean the Venezuelan economy off of fossil fuels and its dependence upon fossil fuels. And now the country is paying the price for that very dearly, especially in the current environment where the price of a barrel of oil has absolutely plummeted to mind-boggling levels. It's recovered a little bit recently, but at this level, the Venezuelan economy is bound to suffer. And with because of the structure of the Venezuelan economy, and with these punishing, inhumane sanctions that Venezuela is having to deal with, I mean, the state is getting a double whammy, which is really creating hardship for the people. So I think that is absolutely imperative. They're in a tough spot now because they had a moment when they were generating very substantial revenues from the sale of oil, when the price of oil was elevated and when they weren't subject to this crushing sanctions regime. They should have used those revenues to a far greater degree to transition the country to renewable energy. To a lesser extent, I think that's also true in Bolivia. So they're in a tough spot. Nonetheless, there is some latitude for maneuver, and unfortunately, I don't get the sense that Maduro government, and obviously Evo Morales is no longer in a position to actually affect Bolivian government policy, but Nicolas Maduro is, and I don't get the sense that he's really understood the urgent need to transition the Venezuelan economy away from oil. That would, if it was really truly generating its energy from renewable sources domestically, it would be much less vulnerable to the types of shenanigans we're seeing from the Trump administration, which ultimately aren't designed to protect the human rights of the Venezuelan people. Trump couldn't care less about the human rights of the Venezuelan people or any other people. It's all about American hegemony, and he's willing to cause untold suffering to innocent civilians, as he's doing in Iran, as he's doing in other countries, in order to achieve a hegemonic agenda. That's what this is about. I don't think anybody should have any doubts about the fact that Western governments, not just Trump, it's also true of our own government, it's true of European governments. We shouldn't have any doubts about the fact that they will readily dispense with human rights if they feel that it will advance their geopolitical agenda. They've done it for decades. So let's just dispense with this nonsense, this myth that our governments are protecting human rights around the world. And let's take a hard look at what they're actually trying to do. And let's mount some effective resistance to that agenda, because it's not consistent with the values that we claim to have.
Yeah, and I would just say, one final thing about Venezuela is, is that while it's laudable, for the Maduro government to try to strengthen participatory democracy and have more and have more spaces and more legislators that want to strengthen democracy. That's all laudable, but that's not going to stop the economic warfare and the economic terrorism that Trump, Trudeau, the Boris Johnson government, and all the other Western and even Latin American countries want in the scramble for oil and mining in Venezuela, which is why I wish that more people who have their feet on the ground in Venezuela and know people who are advisors or a part of the Bolivarian movement to say to Maduro, now is the time that we need to transition off of fossil fuels, because it's not good for the environment. It's not even good for our own impoverished people who get affected by air pollution, and it makes us clash with indigenous people. In the forest, but also, the petrodollar is a stranglehold on the economy, which is why, they are trying to, oust our leader and replace it with, a very reactionary, Western-backed, right-wing oligarch.
Yeah, Guaido, who has absolutely zero democratic legitimacy, but who's exactly. Held up by our governments as the president of Venezuela. It would be laughable if it weren't so sad,
So on to the next question. So given the entire establishment, as well as the insincere, inconsistent, progressive on everything except Palestine, which was a bitter dividing issue when you tried to pass Palestine justice policies in the Green Party. Are you afraid because knowing you, if you were to become leader of the Green Party, you are going to be carrying that banner of Palestine justice. But given the extreme the still extreme hostile climate Palestine justice folk face, as well as the liberals, the NTP, and the conservatives who all support the IHRA definition, which says that criticizing Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism, criticizing the ideology of Zionism or saying Israel was founded on racism is anti-Semitism. Are you not afraid that you might face the same treatment Jeremy Corbyn in Britain faced?
I am absolutely certain that I'm going to face comparable attacks, and in fact, they've already begun. I mean, within 24 hours of my announcing my candidacy on Twitter, I mean, nobody really paid attention to it, but I was tagged in a tweet by the main pro-Israel lobby organization in this country, who immediately started smearing me. And I think as we get closer to the moment when party members are going to have to decide if I'm perceived by pro-Israel groups and politicians and media figures as being close to winning the leadership, if that's their perception, I fully expect that those attacks are going to intensify. That's one of the reasons why I thought long and hard about getting involved in this race, because I know what's coming. I've seen what was done to Jeremy Corbyn. It was awful and ugly. It pained me to see him to have to endure these lifelong anti-racist, to endure these scurrilous attacks. They're even doing it to Bernie Sanders, who doesn't have a radical pro-Palestinian agenda. I mean, the man has very modest, and they're calling Bernie Sanders a lifelong anti-racist who's Jewish and anti-Semite. I mean, it's astonishing. So yeah, you'd have to be out to lunch not to believe that a strong advocate of Palestinian rights is going to confront such attacks in the political arena. But for me, it comes back to something that a good friend of mine, Dr. Tarek Loubani, who's a Palestinian-Canadian who was shot by an Israeli sniper in Gaza in 2018, he said this, at a speech in 2017, that in many ways Palestine is a litmus test for the moral integrity of a leader, because what's being done to the Palestinians is so bad. It's been done for so long and with such deep complicity on the part of our government that if you aren't prepared to stand up for Palestinian human rights, then you can't be trusted to take a principled stand on any issue that invites attacks from powerful constituencies. And I agree with him. I think it's a litmus test. I'm not running for the leadership in order to promote Palestinian human rights. But I can assure you that I will never throw the Palestinian people under the bus. I will defend them tooth and nail. And I don't care what the attacks are. Because at the end of the day, I believe, as I said at the outset, in the universality of human rights. They're human beings. They have every entitlement to human rights, every bit as much as we do, every bit as much as Israelis do. And if you can't embrace that principle, then you're not fit to hold political office, in my opinion.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders. He was interviewed on AJ Plus and was asked why he signs this letter with the rest of Congress that said that the UN was too mean to Israel. He and then he defended it, and he said we have Saudi Arabia, and I don't see many people making that much of a stink about Saudi Arabia, and I thought, okay, I can let that one slide. But then he later went on to say that he rejects the BDS movement, and that he's also opposed to the democratic one-state solution, since for many people in the Palestine justice movement, the two-state solution is basically a two-state delusion, and it's dead, especially with the current emboldened regime of Benjamin Netanyahu and his ultra-Zionist coalition.
Yeah. It's totally dead. It was, the Israeli government killed it decades ago, and now it's just like I'm sorry to use these words, but like a rotting corpse. And it's time for us to move on from this and accept the fact that there's only one practical solution at this stage. That's a one-state solution in which everybody is treated equally. And why in God's name would anybody find that offensive? I mean, Bernie Sanders, he did reject the BDS movement, and I criticize him for that, but he at least was willing to do this much. He was willing to ask whether they should be conditioning this massive military aid to Israel, which is now, I think, $3.3 billion a year for a small country like Israel, which has got high, Western style standard of living. To receive that kind of money every year in military aid is astonishing. It's a huge amount of money. It's the only state in the Middle East that has a nuclear arsenal. And he was actually prepared to just ask the question, should we be conditioning military aid on Israel respecting the human rights of the Palestinian people? And for that, he was vilified. A member of the Jewish community who has a lifelong record of opposing racism. So, I think you have to accept, if you're going to get into politics and be committed to the defense of Palestinian human rights, you have to accept that you're going to get attacked. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be relentless. But if we don't face up to those attacks, then we may as well pack up our bags and go home, man, because it's not just with Palestine. The fossil fuels industry vilifies people who call for the shutting down of the fossil fuels industry. The rich vilify people who call for massive redistribution of wealth. This is not just, you see the wealthy and the powerful constantly using their power to silence criticism and to silence and negate reform. We have to be willing to stand up to those attacks if we're going to actually make our world a better place.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to two Palestine events. I went to one Palestine festival where John Pilger, Peter Obor, and Miko Peled were speaking at, as well as Asa Winstanley of the Electronic Intifada. I remember getting the chance to talk to Miko Peled after he was done speaking, and Ilan Pape had a speech, John Pilger had a speech. And I asked Miko Peled, I asked him, what do you think of Bernie Sanders, who rejects not only the democratic one-state solution, but even rejects BDS as the best way for the Palestinians to achieve justice and the just solution to the occupation and the conflict. And then Miko Peled, said, boldly, boldly and bluntly, that hey, Bernie Sanders doing that. Look, any politician or anyone who claims that they're a socialist or they're progressive, but they're willing to throw Palestinians under the bus, simply aren't, they're just not real socialists or not real progressives, is basically what he was saying. And he was saying that you can't be that, and he was, saying to me that you cannot be selectively for human rights, just like you cannot be selectively anti-war. And
absolutely. And to her credit, our former Green Party of Canada leader Elizabeth May, when she came back from the West Bank in 2018, she went on a trip with some other parliamentarians. She said at a press conference, you can see this on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
What she said was that what Israel is doing to occupied Palestinians is much worse than apartheid in South Africa. This is not only her judgment, it's the judgment of Noam Chomsky, one of the most respected intellectuals, public intellectuals alive today. This is the perspective. He said exactly the same thing on Democracy Now! John Dugard, a South African human rights lawyer who was the UN Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in Palestine. The facts on the ground make this abundantly clear. This is an apartheid system. It's even worse than the apartheid system in South Africa. And, once you've accepted that, once you've realized that, you just step back and say, what kind of a person would lavish praise on a state that's doing that to people purely because of their ethnicity, that's subjecting them to a system of apartheid that's even worse, much worse than what Black South Africans experienced? How can you say that somebody who supports that regime is fit to hold political office in a democratic country that claims to be committed to human rights? I'll say this very clearly, and I'm going to say it again and again. If you support Israel, you are not fit to hold political office because you're supporting an apartheid regime. It's even worse because of the gravity of Israel's crimes than supporting the Afrikaner regime in South Africa. Now, looking back at that era, would we say that somebody who supported that regime was fit to hold political office? I don't think so. I think most people would say no. Well, it's even more true in the case of Israel, because its form of apartheid is even more cruel and inhumane. So for me, this is a no-brainer. And I think the tide is turning. There's lots of evidence of that if you look in the polling. And within a few years, I think it's going to be mainstream to say the kinds of things that I'm saying. And people who were not willing to say these things are going to look back and are going to hang their heads in shame. That day is coming, and I think it's going to happen in my lifetime.
My only suggestion is as the leadership bid goes on, and if you were to become leader, please don't do what Jeremy Corbyn and his leadership and his advisors do, which was throw Palestine justice activists under the bus, including Jewish anti-Zionists, under the bus, and then concede that yes, there's an anti-Semitism crisis, but we're dealing with it, thinking that was going to appease their critics, when really all it did was, it just destroyed Corbyn's integrity, demoralized much of his popular base, and all it did was give all the ammunition that the Blairites, the Tories, the Lib Dems, and the entire British establishment needed to destroy Jeremy Corbyn's bid to become prime minister.
I think Mr. Corbyn made a mistake in that regard. I mean, he was right to acknowledge that anti-Semitism is a grave problem and a growing problem, and that and to commit himself to fighting anti-Semitism, but to lend legitimacy to the smears of anti-racist members of his own party who were defending Palestinian rights,
including Jews. Many of them were Jewish
absolutely.
People, Jewish anti-Zionists.
That's true. Absolutely true. I saw it. It was very sad. I would rather lose the leadership race than throw those brave, defenders of human rights under the bus. I would rather lose honorably than win dishonorably, and I will never do that. Not just with respect to Palestinian human rights, pro-Palestinian human rights advocates. Anybody who's on the side of justice, if winning means I have to betray them, I'm not interested in winning. The holding the position doesn't matter that much to me. Human rights does.
Yeah, and actually, then this is a good segue. I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip this one question. I might come back to it. So, if you become leader of the Green Party and you get a seat in Parliament, you will be one of the few voices of reasons who challenges the epic myth and con that Canada is a force for good in the world, and is when Canada is on the wrong side of history in Venezuela, should be out of NATO, and Canada's on the wrong history when it comes to Palestine, Haiti, Bolivia, Brazil. And you, of course, are familiar with the truth-telling and myth-busting of Eva Engler. So what are some of the issues you want to champion and hold the government and fake opposition to account in the event you hopefully become leader of the Green Party and get a seat in Parliament?
Well, as I said at the outset, I want to start a debate about whether we should be in NATO. I want to start a debate about whether we should even have a standing army. Why does Canada need a standing army? I mean, maybe at the end of the day, there's a justification for it, but we're not even having a conversation about that. We have the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. No other state, we don't share a border with any other state. We're separated by an ocean from Africa and Europe. We're separated by an ocean from Asia. Where is the threat? Why do we need a standing army? I don't get it. Why are we sending our troops abroad? Why don't we have a constitutional provision that says we can only send our troops abroad if Parliament declares war? So I want to have that conversation. I want to, talk about all of the human rights violators. You mentioned a few of them that our government has historically supported. We're currently in cahoots with this murderous regime in Egypt, led by this dictator Sisi, accused of running a torture assembly line by Human Rights Watch. We are supporting, as I mentioned, we're selling deadly weapons to the Saudis, and in the course of their absolutely horrific and criminal war in Yemen. We're supporting the government of Bahrain, another brutal, ruthless autocracy. Our prime minister was just meeting with dictators in sub-Saharan Africa in order to gain their favor in his efforts to gain a seat for Canada on the UN Security Council. And I don't have any confidence that we got that seat, that Justin Trudeau would use it to actually advance the cause of peace and justice in this world. I don't trust him to do that with that seat. So I want to challenge that myth. I want to talk about the fact that we say the word equality in this country, while at the same time we allow 10 people to control $65 billion of wealth. And we have tens of thousands of people living in the streets of this country on any given night. And we have millions of people in this country living in poverty. That's democracy. That's respect for the principle of equality. I mean, we need to give our heads a collective shake. The mythology of this country and the reality of this country, these are things which are separated by a vast expanse. But the good news is that we can actually make the mythology a reality with, determined, principled leadership, by bringing together grassroots organizations, by unifying people, by letting people have a real say in how our government is functioned. We can become the dream of what Canada can and should be, and what we like to think of ourselves as. But we got a lot of work to do to get there. And I think we need to start by recognizing how far away we are from that ideal.
So will you one of the places where Canada plays a really negative role. You mentioned parts of Africa. Will you try to hold the current government into account when it comes to Rwanda and the mythology around Romeo Dallaire?
Yeah, sure. I don't think Canada's role in Rwanda has been nearly what we have. What our media and our politicians have told us to be. The current leader of Rwanda is one of the most brutal leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. Our prime minister was over there recently, yucking it up. You can see photos of him sitting down with the current leader of Rwanda, acting as though he's some kind of champion of human rights and a true Democrat.
When he was the one that actually instigated the mass slaughter, which we all call the Rwandan genocide. He was actually the preferred. He was actually the guy who started it, and the guy whose hands are drenched in blood with it.
Absolutely, he's deeply complicit in one of the most horrific human rights episodes in the post-World War II period in the history of humanity, really. And here's our prime minister smiling and yucking it up with him, and then claiming to be a champion of human rights. I sometimes I wake up in the morning and just shake my head that this stuff even gets taken seriously. How is it that the press gallery doesn't, fall down in uproarious laughter when they hear the prime minister of our country claim to be a champion of human rights? It's so ludicrous. So yeah, absolutely. I want to stand up in Parliament and I want to start articulating a critique which is connected to the reality, which takes account of the evidence and the historical fact or the historical record, and challenge the politicians of this country to actually justify their behavior, because no one's doing it. No one's doing it in the mainstream media. No one's doing it in Parliament. So every time, let's just take a simple example. When Chrystia Freeland was the foreign minister, she would stand up constantly condemning the government of Nicolas Maduro, this horrific human rights violator, this brutal dictator, massacring his own people. And at the same time, she was selling weapons or allowing weapons to be sold to the Saudi autocracy, which is an actual monster. Now, I never saw a single press conference when anybody from the press corps said to her, well, Ms. Freeland, it's funny you're talking about human rights because your government is selling deadly weapons to the Saudi autocracy. So why should Canadians take you seriously? Anybody with half a brain could have asked that question. It was an obvious question, but no one would even ask it. They just gave Ms. Freeland a free ride. Just let her, waltz through these press conferences time and time again, condemning Maduro, claiming to be a champion of human rights without ever challenging her with the most obvious basic facts. So I think we need somebody in Parliament who does that. We need at least one voice. Hopefully there'll be many more, but at least one voice who will challenge this narrative.
You mentioned that you would like Canada to get out of NATO, which I definitely support. Because I think, if the term war is a racket really applies to anything, it applies to NATO, and it smashes also the mythology that much of the Scandinavian countries and Western Europe and so forth are a force for good in the world, when it's really just a huge Western club and a front for imperialism. But that being said, when it comes to the issue of Ukraine, which divides many people on the left bitterly, how would you articulate and explain to people that that we do need to get out of NATO, but we do, if we want to see the civil war in Ukraine, and we do need to have détente with Russia. However, oligarchic and autocratic Putin is.
Yeah. Well, we have an amazing ability to forget history when we look at these kinds of crises and think about how to resolve them. Even when the history is not the distant history, it's the relatively recent history. If you look at the historical record, and all this information is publicly available, there's ample evidence that the United States government, through one of its minions, Victoria Nuland, helped to orchestrate a coup d'etat in the Ukraine. And at the time that it happened, was the Ukrainian leader corrupt? There's evidence to suggest that he, in fact, was corrupt. Was he pro-Russian? There's evidence to suggest certainly that he was pro-Russian. But he was democratically elected. And at the time that Ms. Nuland helped to orchestrate a coup d'etat, an election was only a few months away, and I don't recall there being any real indication that election wasn't going to go forward. But she wasn't confident that the outcome was going to be the outcome that the American government wanted, and so they fomented unrest in the Ukraine and ended up helping come to power a pro-Western right-wing government that was virulently anti-Russian. Now, let's just stop there for a second, and let's recall that no country in the world sustained the kinds of civilian casualties and military casualties that the Russian people sustained in the Second World War. Their casualties vastly exceed those of any of the allies, I think of all the allies put together, as a matter of fact, the UK, Canada, the United States, and so forth. So they have, understandably, a very powerful sense of historical trauma for what they experienced. And now all of a sudden they had on their borders a hostile pro-Western right-wing government, which, by the way, has been infiltrated to some degree by neo-Nazi elements. And they reacted to that. Now, did they react to that in a way that was peaceful? No, there was some violence there. There have been some human rights violations on the pro-Russian side, no doubt about it. And I don't advocate any military solution or attempted solution of a military nature in conflicts of that nature. But we have to understand, I've often said that the art of diplomacy is seeing the world through the eyes of your enemy. So let's stop and look at how the Russian people view this. How did this happen? What did they experience before the coup in the Ukraine? So that's the background. And then what happened? There was a referendum organized in Crimea by pro-Russian sympathizers. And by all accounts, the referendum was overwhelmingly in favor of unification with Russia. I believe the numbers were somewhere in excess of 95% voted in favor of union with Russia, and the voter turnout was in excess of 80%. How often do you see those kinds of numbers in a Western election or in a Western referendum? And there was a report recently in the Washington Post, saying that the people of Crimea are happier today, if anything, with the union with Russia than they were even then. They're more supportive of it even now than they were then. And historically, Crimea was part of Russia. So is this really some kind of grotesque injustice that warrants crushing sanctions being imposed upon Russia by Western states? Does that sound like the kind of scenario that warrants us antagonizing a nuclear superpower? And I think finally it's really instructive to contrast the way we've dealt with this so-called illegal annexation of Crimea to how we in the West have dealt with what is clearly Israel's illegal annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights.
Yeah.
By our own government's account, I'm just telling you what the Canadian government and other Western governments say. They say that Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, which happened over 30 years ago, is illegal. They say that Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, which happened decades ago, is illegal. And yet, what are they doing in respect of Israel? Are they imposing sanctions on Israel the way they've imposed sanctions on Russia for what they say is the illegal annexation of Crimea? No. And not only have they not imposed sanctions on Israel, they're giving billions of dollars of military aid to Israel every year. They're entering into free trade agreements with Israel. They're giving preferential tariff treatment to goods that are produced in Israel's illegal settlements. So, I mean, give me a break. You're telling me, Mr. Trudeau and Ms. Freeland, that the reason why you're imposing sanctions on Russia is because you care about the human rights of Ukrainians? I don't believe it for one second. This is about geopolitics. It's about American hegemony. And you are acting as the vassals of the U.S. government. That's what Trudeau and Freeland have been doing.
Why do you think so many on the left supported the ouster I've forgotten his name, but the Ukrainian leader who was ousted when the Euromaiden protests happened? Why do you think so many on the left jumped the shark and supported that? Do you think Western NGOs, both with a good reputation like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, and even CEDA and the National Endowment from Democracy were able to hoodwink a lot of left-leaning people to support the Euromaidan protests and basically advocate for a civil war with in Ukraine, because they felt that, well, this is a way to stick it to Putin, who's a right wing who's a right winger, and of course now with the whole Trump derangement, Russia Putin derangement syndrome, it seems as if people still are supporting conflict in Ukraine, even though Zelensky would like détente and for it to end.
I think we shouldn't be naive, and I think we should acknowledge the fact. I have a lot of respect for Amnesty. I'll tell you, I actually contribute money to Amnesty, every month. So they do a lot of good work, but I don't think we should be naive, and we should recognize that organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch tend to view things from a Western government lens. They are willing to be critical of Western governments and their proxies and allies, sometimes very intensely critical. But they do have a pro-Western bias, number one. Number two, as I said, the leader of the Ukraine at the time, who was overthrown by this coup, there was evidence to suggest that he was corrupt and that he was anti-democratic, and he was allied with Putin. And there are legitimate critiques to be leveled against Putin. He is authoritarian. He is homophobic. He has acted in a repressive manner towards the media. There's plenty of valid critiques to be leveled against him. Where I think these Western human rights organizations failed is in understanding that there was a peaceful way to address the concerns of the human rights community. And that was to have an election in the Ukraine that was monitored by the international community carefully, and that was as close to a democratic and transparent election as we could possibly get it to be, and let the Ukrainian people as a whole, both those who were pro-Russian and pro-Western, make the decision peacefully and democratically. That's what we should have done. Supporting a violent coup d'etat, which put in power a right-wing government that was infiltrated by neo-Nazi movements, was outrageous and contrary to the mission of organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and contrary to the stated goal of Western governments to promote human rights around the world. So there were, this is the thing about, propaganda, is that when it has elements of kernels of truth to it, it can be very difficult.
I was just about to say that I think one of the reasons why so many on the left jumped the shark on Ukraine, and of course my previous guest Yves Engler talked about in his book Left to Right Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada, is that many of them do get seduced by NGOs and left-leaning outlets that support it, but then a lot of it also has to do with the fact that, as you just mentioned, with Ukraine and Syria is also the same thing. The powers to be, especially when they have their pockets in the NGOs, they manipulate the half-truths in order for people to basically endorse full-scale imperialism. Like Gaddafi was oppressive, but it's not true that he was giving black mercenaries and his soldiers Viagra so that they could commit mass rape. And Amnesty later had to walk that back and say no, there's no evidence to support that. Was Assad brutal when it came to people protesting in Syria? Yes, but he's not this this genocidal Shia fundamentalist they depict him to be. And is Putin autocratic? Yes, but he did not cause Trump to become elected.
Don't even get me started. It's so ludicrous. Hillary Clinton did more through her incompetence and her arrogance and her complete disregard for the poor and working class Americans and her slavish fidelity to Wall Street. She did more to get Donald Trump elected than Putin ever could have done. And all of those American oligarchs who lavished money on Trump did more than Putin could ever have done to get Trump elected. People want to be upset about Trump getting elected and how he got elected. They have every reason to be irate. But let's look at the true villains here. The true villains are the oligarchs and the politicians like Hillary Clinton who are in their pocket. That's how we got in this mess. This is nonsense. Putin got Trump elected. I mean, I can't believe this narrative ever gained any traction at all. It's so ludicrous.
But isn't Canada itself also flirting with anti-Russia Putin derangement syndrome?
Absolutely, and the leader of that whole initiative is Chrystia Freeland, who is now the deputy prime minister. Chrystia Freeland has been propagating this myth that Putin is, the greatest evil confronting the world today from the moment she assumed political office. As I said, there's plenty of good reason to criticize Putin, but there are far worse leaders in the world today than Vladimir Putin. One of them is the king of Saudi Arabia, to whom we're selling deadly weapons.
Exactly, and who also exports Islamists across across the globe. And while many people do rightfully denounce the Saudi UAE-backed Western-backed Gulf destruction of Yemen, it's also the same thing in Syria, where Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey have all exported Islamists with the full knowledge of the Canadian, British, French, and American deep states, in exporting and actually exporting ISIS, all the efforts to overthrow Assad's.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you can go down the list of worldwide tyrants. As bad as Putin is, there are plenty, unfortunately, who are much worse. And many of them are being slavishly supported by Western governments. So, give us a break. and stop telling us that what you're really concerned about is the human rights of the Ukrainians or the Russian people, because that's just not the case. And the historical record makes that abundantly clear. Abundantly clear.
So going back to climate science, do you have any thoughts on how to combat the meat and others in the food industry when it comes to the climate crisis? Because I've seen two documentaries and other reports that said that how we consume our meat is more deadly for the environment than all of our fossil fuel extractions and consumptions, like with cars. And do you have any thoughts on that, and why so many in the eco-socialist and green movements don't talk much about the meat industry?
I think I think they're concerned that they're going to alienate a lot of people if they start putting pressure on people to abandon a meat-based diet. I mean, we don't actually, I don't think, have to abandon entirely a meat-based diet, but we have to drastically reduce our consumption of livestock, and particularly beef. And, I think we just have to come to terms with that and explain to people that that's not just something that is desirable from an environmental perspective, but it's actually desirable from a health perspective.
Yeah.
Eating so much red meat is the scientific evidence that is damaging to a human being's health is overwhelming. And so we need to start making the health case, not just the environmental case about that. And there's many ways we can go about reducing substantially our consumption of beef and other red meats. One is we can do it through an education program. Another is we can do it through forms of taxation. We can impose tax on those types of food products that aren't applicable to other food products. We can invest in, we can help subsidize vegetarian diets in a variety of ways. So I think we really need to start putting resources into moving away from a meat-based diet to a plant-based diet. And I think we'll have a much more healthy population, not just a healthier planet, but a healthy human population if we do that. I don't think a lot of people in our country have entirely understood the health impacts of the way we eat. So we can do a better job of educating people about that.
Yeah, and it does seem just like going back to the issue of Palestine justice and more broadly anti-imperialism. It does seem as if many Greens are still hesitant to confront the global military-industrial complex, the arms industry, because they don't want to be depicted as lefty loonies or anything like that. But you do have to call. I mean, if you are going to call out the system, and you say that systemic things need to change, you do have to call out that system by its name, and that is if you call out the fossil fuel industry, then you do also have to call out the arms industry, nuclear weapons, and the meat industry, and through science and through science and broad people power, look at how we can how we can find a sustainable economy which addresses the issues of how do we have a sustainable, healthy diet.
Yeah.
And talk about this organization you were part of, which I think made a couple of headlines during the last federal election of last year. Talk about Disruption Canada and your shall I say infamous confrontation with Justin Trudeau at a rally of his.
I've had a few encounters with Justin Trudeau. So the underlying premise of Disruption Network Canada is that the media was not doing a good job of exposing the hypocrisy and the intellectual dishonesty of our political leaders. And so I and Dee Vengler and other activists got together a few months before the election and thought, how can we get our message across? And we decided a good way to do that would be to show up at events at which leading politicians were speaking and to heckle them and, to express our point of view and get it force it onto the public agenda. We did that on a number of events.
So the Canadian Code Pink then.
Yes, Code Pink was in many ways an inspirational model for us. I love Code Pink. They do great work. I think Medea Benjamin is a hero. And so this is not, we were not the inventors of this methodology. Others have perfected it to an art, like Medea Benjamin, and we just decided to give it a try in Canada, try to sensitize people to what was going on in advance of the election last year. And so, yeah, I mean, there were a number of events where I and other members of Disruption Network Canada showed up at moments when ministers in the Liberal government, leader of the Conservative Party in opposition, Justin Trudeau himself, were speaking, and stood up, interrupted them, and tried to draw attention to a human rights issue or an environmental issue that is of great and pressing importance. What's interesting about it, so I did that. I think I probably encountered the Prime Minister in 3 or 4 events. I remember the third time I showed up at an event he was going to speak at in Montreal. It was actually the day when he was voting. It was the election day itself. Yves Engler and I figured out from press reports at what polling station he was going to go vote and at what time. So we showed up there, and Yves had this big poster, which described Justin Trudeau as a climate criminal. And I was there, to provide moral support to Yves and also to film the disruption. And as I was approaching the site, the polling station, somebody in plain clothes, who looked like he could be a police officer, but he was in plain clothes, approached me. And he said to me, "Good morning, Mr. Lascaris, how are you doing?" And I said, "Have we met before?"
Really?
He goes, yeah. I said, "Have we met before?" I said, "No." He said to me, "Well, I don't know if we've met before, but I'm well familiar with you." And I said, "So who are you?" And he said, I'm an officer in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I'm part of the Prime Minister's security detachment." And even I had a similar experience that same week when Justin Trudeau was going to speak at an event in Montreal before the election. We were approached. We tried to enter a hotel room with the view to entering an event where he was speaking, and we were stopped. We were not only approached, we were physically prevented from entering the venue, even though we've never done anything to give anybody reason to think we're a threat to Prime Minister, and we weren't even allowed to get within 100 meters of the event. And the people who were speaking to us, clearly, because we'd never met them before, had been provided photographs of me and Yves. So we have a situation because they recognized us immediately on site, and we'd never met them before. So they'd been told our names, they'd been given some kind of profile information about us, they'd seen photographs of us, and they were ready for us. And so it's very disturbing to me, and I wrote about this on my website, that the security detail of the Prime Minister is actually familiarizing itself with people who pose no threat whatsoever to the Prime Minister, but are critical of him, publicly critical of him, and they're preventing him. The state's resources are being employed by the Prime Minister to prevent people from showing up at his events and criticizing what he's saying. That's profoundly anti-democratic. It's really a great concern to me. Whether this is being done to me or any other activist, I would object profoundly. This is not the function of the Prime Minister's security detail to protect him from dissent and criticism. It's to protect him from physical threats, which I fully support. Okay, and they're being misused, these resources, these security resources, in order to protect the Prime Minister's narrative about this country. So I think all Canadians should be very concerned about that.
I remember I found 2 Facebook posts, from Twitter of you confronting the Prime Minister, and you famously called him a fraud when it came to his support for the Saudi slaughter in Yemen, and then you also confronted him. Of course, he just continued walking about supporting Palestine, supporting Israel when they gunned down the Palestinian journalists who you mentioned were even Canadian. And
when they gunned down Tarek Loubani, a friend of mine. Yeah, so he 3 weeks after an Israeli sniper shot a Canadian Palestinian doctor in circumstances where there was no conceivable justification for the shooting, Justin Trudeau's government entered into a free trade agreement with Israel, an enhanced free trade agreement with Israel. It essentially rewarded Israel after it committed an atrocity, a war crime against a Canadian doctor, because that's what it was. It was a war crime. So, I mean, how can you not come to the conclusion that when it comes to human rights, Justin Trudeau is a fraud? Yeah, he's a fraud, and I'll say so anywhere, anytime.
And while you were calling him a human rights hypocrite, and you kept saying that the Trudeau liberal cult followers kept kept shouting over you, Trudeau, Trudeau, Trudeau,
Yeah.
Trudeau.
Yeah, that was kind of fun. You know, unfortunately, I'm not as loud as they are, so I got kind of drowned out. But these are the kinds of actions we have to employ at this stage, because unfortunately our mainstream media is just not doing the job that it is designed to, or it was supposed to be designed to do. If it were doing that job, it wouldn't be necessary for people like me or Eve or our colleagues in the activist community to disrupt the prime minister and ministers of his cabinet.
Well, hopefully, if you become leader of the Green Party and have a seat in Parliament, you'll be able to
Yes.
give a good finger wag to Justin head on.
Yeah, there'll be no more need to engage in those sorts of disruptions. That's for sure.
Is Disruption Canada still going on though? Like, is it still in will it still be in existence indefinitely for however long need be?
I hope so. I mean, I don't know if I'm not able to give any significant time or energy to it now because I'm running for the leadership, and I don't think really it's appropriate for me to do that now that I'm running for political office. But I think as long as our mainstream media, corporate media are failing to do the job that the citizenry needs it to do, there is a very important role to be played by organizations like Disruption Network Canada. And I know there are a lot of other great people who are involved in that organization, and I really hope that they continue to continue that work until such time as it's no longer necessary.
So we've mentioned the current prime minister a couple of times, and that leads me to this question, this second to last question, which is why were so many people who call themselves Greens, not necessarily members of the Green Party, but people who identify with the Green movement. So why were so many of them leftists, unions, people like David Suzuki? Why did they fall for the con of Justin Trudeau, given his party, the Liberal Party's actual track record on climate change, on NAFTA, imperialism, apartheid towards First Nations, his support for the TPP and the Canadian deep state, and why, even though he lost his majority, was he still given a second, albeit slim, chance of a minority government last year?
Well, yeah, I think we have in this country this electoral system called first past the post.
Me who follows British politics is quite familiar with that in Australian politics.
Yeah, whereas the continent in Europe and many other places around the world, they have a proportional representation system. So in our system, regrettably, the two major parties, the Conservatives and Liberals, who really disagree on very little at the end of the day, they basically trade power. It's been like a ping pong game in federal government in Canada throughout the post-World War II period between these two parties.
Yeah, it was the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives, which were basically two rival oligarch parties.
Right, and the Progressive Conservatives abandoned that name when they merged over a decade ago with an even more right-wing party, and they became just the Conservatives. So they dropped Progressive. So and they were led for a while by Stephen Harper. And so when the 2015 election, when Justin Trudeau was first elected as prime minister, people were just like desperate to get the Stephen Harper Conservatives out of office. I ran for the Green Party in that election, and I lost count of the number of times I walked up to somebody's door and knocked on the front door and said, "I'm Dimitri Lascaris. I'm running for the Green Party of Canada. Here's what I think we should be doing about our country." Many people I spoke to were very sympathetic, but they said, Justin Trudeau has promised us that if he comes to power, this will be the last election under the first past the post system. And once we get rid of the first past the post system, then I can vote for you and your party and know that my vote is going to count. Because right now, my vote's going to get wasted. So I'm going to give it to the Liberals because I have to choose between these two options. And I would say that the Stephen Harper Conservatives are much worse. And so ultimately, that had a big impact. I think also the failure of the Green Party to really position itself as a champion of the left and to stick to what I regard as an unsuccessful strategy to stake out a ground in the center of the political spectrum. I think that contributed to the fact that we weren't able to garner a lot of votes. But a big part of it was the first past the post system. And, Justin Trudeau's rhetoric and the NDP leader at the time, Thomas Mulcair, moving the party to the right. So it was very easy for Justin Trudeau to outflank the NDP, the traditionally social democratic party, by adopting modestly progressive initiatives like slightly increasing the top marginal tax rate. All of this came together to, get Justin Trudeau just enough support to win a majority under the first past the post system in 2015. Then when we came up to this election, this time he barely scraped into power. He doesn't have a majority. He lost a lot of support. But at the end of the day, we still had this first pass,
which I consider a very good thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Many people would disagree with that because the second largest party is still the Conservatives, who have gone and this is a conversation for another day. But the Conservatives have gone even more cartoonishly right-wing since Stephen Harper has left, and the ascendancy of Andrew Scheer, Jason Kenney, Doug Ford. But continue with what you're saying about the Liberals and Trudeau.
Ford and Kenney are provincial leaders, but they are symptomatic of an even further shift to the right by the Conservative parties around this country, I think. And so, he suffered a loss in the 2019 election, Trudeau, in support, but he was still a major beneficiary of the first past the post system and the dread that a lot of Canadians felt about this Andrew Scheer Conservative government taking over. And also, again, I think we had a glorious opportunity, the Green Party, to position ourselves as the champion of the left. The NDP leadership had been largely discredited by Mulcair, but we adopted this slogan, neither left nor right, but forward. I don't even know what that means, frankly, but one thing
I had a criticism about that. Well, I have a criticism towards all of the party slogans, like the NDP, in it for you, Liberals, forward, Conservative. I don't even remember what the Conservative was. I think that the Quebec, the popular Quebec Nationalist Party was just Quebec Sinew or something like that.
Political slogans, they're endless entertainment. I mean, they communicate no meaningful information, but they're treated as though they're somehow the gospel and the embodiment of the party's soul. I mean, anyways, I think that the party had this opportunity to stake out that ground on the left, and instead what it did was it tried to occupy, first of all, I don't think sitting in the center of the political spectrum is consistent with our core values. I think we are fundamentally a party of the left, if you look at our core values. But from the perspective of strategy, just electoral self-interest, why are we trying to compete with the well-established parties who have occupied the center of the political spectrum for decades? We're not going to out-liberal the Liberals. We're not going to, displace the Liberals as the predominant party of the center, which, by the way, they're not. They're more a center-right party. But this is the way they position themselves. We can't win that fight. We're never going to win that fight. As long as we are positioning ourselves as the centrists, we're going to get crushed. We're going to remain. We don't even have 1% of the seats in Parliament. And the last election was probably the most favorable electoral circumstances we've ever enjoyed as a party. And yet we couldn't even win more than 3 seats. So I think we have to understand that this strategy we've employed of positioning ourselves as a centrist party, even though our values are essentially quintessentially left-wing values, is a failure. It's not working. And so we should stop trying to compete with the Liberals for the Liberal vote, and let's start to compete for the progressive vote in this country. And as I say, I think that's a majority of Canadians.
And you said in your opening statement, your opening pitch, when you had a meeting with Green Party voters, and there are 2 other candidates. You said that that you're not interested in trying to reach out to those who sincerely believe in the climate destructive policies and oligarchic policies and warmongering of the Jason Kenneys of the world, the Stephen Harpers of the world, and the Doug Fords of the world, and that you want to really try to reach out to those who, and these are my words, those
Mhm.
who foolishly believed that Justin Trudeau was going to be a progressive champion and the climate champion and the friend of First Nations, that you want to try to reach out to them, and also people who are who have become disillusioned with the NDP. Now, are you now? Which I say, yeah, go for it. But are you afraid that you might get people who say, well, Dimitri, I can understand that you want to reach out to those disillusioned liberal voters, but why try to take the votes and the grassroots supports that the NDP has? How would you respond to that?
Well, why wouldn't we? I mean, if I want to attract anybody to this party who shares our values. And I think the vast majority of the people, a lot of people who are friends of mine, are members of the NDP and have supported the NDP their entire lives. Their values are very similar to my own. Why wouldn't I? Just because they've traditionally been supporters of another political party, I'm going to push them away, even though their values are the same as mine and the same as those of the Green Party? No, not at all. I mean, we should bring anybody who shares our values is welcome in the Green Party tent. If you don't share our values, you're not welcome here. If you support the agenda of Jason Kenney or Doug Ford or Andrew Scheer or Stephen Harper, you got no business being in the Green Party of Canada, I'll tell you right now. But if you do share our values, I don't care what party you've politically supported in the past. You should join us, because this is where you're at home, and together we can make the country the kind of country that we want it to be, not the country that they want it to be. To me, if the Green Party of Canada isn't trying to siphon off support from other parties that have traditionally enjoyed the support of the progressive community, then it's barking up the wrong tree. It's not going to succeed. That's exactly what we need to be doing, is appealing to the base of the NDP, because most of them are not happy with the direction the party has taken.
And do you think you'll be able to get support in Quebec? And I'm curious, what's your position on the whole the seemingly never-ending soap opera of Quebec independence or no Quebec independence?
I would much rather see Quebec remain a member of the Federation. I think we'll all be better off if that were to be the case. But I would respect the people of Quebec's desire if they voted in a democratic and transparent election to separate. I would respect their decision, and I would negotiate a departure on the most fair and humane terms imaginable, with a minimal disruption to our economy, and try to remain as closely aligned with the people of Quebec as possible and maintain close economic ties and political ties with the people of Quebec. But I think ultimately, whether or not we could persuade Quebecers, and by the way, the sovereigntist movement right now is not particularly strong in Quebec, and it hasn't been for a while. So I think that threat
even though Yves Francois Blanchette, even though his party, basically won in Quebec.
Yeah, I think he's a lot of people in Quebec support the Bloc Québécois, because they feel that the Bloc Québécois is going to look out for the interests of Quebecers in Parliament more than the other parties will. It's not necessarily that they want to separate and they want to do it now. And a lot of people in Quebec didn't vote for the Bloc Québécois. Yeah, they had a very good election relative to the prior election, which was very bad for them. But, a great many Quebecers didn't vote for them, and a great many Quebecers want to remain part of Canada. And I think it's very easy for us to persuade Quebecers to remain part of Canada. What we have to do is we have to respect their culture. We have to respect the fact that they want to organize their society in a different way. They have a different set of values which overlap with ours, but are not necessarily our own. And we have to be sufficiently respectful of their approach to governance and the kind of society that they want to have. And if we are, I have no doubt that the vast majority of Quebecers will want to remain part of this country. The thing that really gave separatism a movement in this country was disrespect from the federal government and other provincial governments. That's what caused a lot of people in Quebec to really start to question whether they should be part of this federation.
Yeah, not many people know. I only knew about this when I was watching the Real News Network when they talked about the victory of the Coalition Avenir de Québec, which is François Legault, right?
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, and the guy from Ricochet Media was explaining that that historically, Quebec, which of course, the inhabitants were First Nations, the indigenous Quebecers, but later, of course, the French took over, and then later the British took over Quebec, and the British were very discriminatory towards Quebec and allowed the Catholic Church, a huge dominance. And many people don't understand that history. A lot of people, a lot of people just think that that Quebecers are just, that a lot of Quebecers just want, to be independent just because of, linguistic chauvinism, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I think I think our country does do a pretty good job of respecting the linguistic rights of Quebecers. And I think we should be doing a better job, I think, of respecting their view about how an economy should be organized, about their environmental concerns. So, for example, we have people in Western Canada, particularly in Alberta, who are irate about the fact that the Quebec government doesn't want a tar sands pipeline crossing its territory. Well, I think that's their entitlement. I mean, they're under no obligation to allow that, especially in a climate emergency. To cross the province, and I fully support the opposition of the Quebec people to anything like that happening. So we just need to be more accommodating and sensitive to the views and ambitions of our brothers and sisters in Quebec. And if we are, I think we'll have no problem holding this country together and making this a stronger union than it's ever been.
All right, well, Dimitri, you have to go for, I know that you have to go right now, so I just want to say thank you for taking the time for this interview. I hope that this will be the first of many conversations in the future. Mm-hmm. I wish you the best of luck in your bid for the Green Party leadership of Canada. I really hope you get a seat, because there needs to be a voice of reason in that parliament. And I think you will definitely rise up to that challenge.
Thank you. I hope so. It's a pleasure on your program.
And then one last question: if you do become a leader, will you hire Jody Wilson Raible to be the Justice Secretary for the Green Party after she was humiliated and disgustingly ousted from the Liberal Party by Trudeau?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't even thought about that. I think that, before I would ever think about doing something like that, I'd need to sit down with her and ask her why she ever ran for the Liberals to begin with.
Exactly.
Maybe she'd explain it to me, but I don't get it. So anyways, but I do admire the fact that she stood by her principles when it came to the SNC-Lavalin scandal. That was a great thing she did.
And she chose to be an independent. She wasn't. Yes. She was ousted from the Liberal Party, which she should have never, have been a member of to begin with. But also, but yeah, under no circumstances was she ever going to join the Conservatives. And the NZP, unfortunately, has a lot. Going back to what you were saying, the NZP unfortunately has a lot to answer for. But hopefully, she'll join the Green Party if you become a leader.
She'd be welcome to join, absolutely. So, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much, Youri.
Likewise.
Okay, take care.
Hi. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.